The howling dust storm raged outside Kale's bunker, a familiar symphony of violence that he had grown accustomed to during his 3 years on Cygnus X-3. The abandoned mining outpost he called home shuddered against the onslaught, but its reinforced walls held firm, as they always did. Kale barely registered the storm anymore. It was just another day in his self-imposed exile. He moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency, checking the atmospheric filters, inspecting the water reclamation system, and taking inventory of his dwindling supplies. The outpost had been designed to support a crew of 12 miners, not a solitary occupant, which meant its systems were robust but oversized, leaving echoing empty spaces that sometimes made the silence even more deafening. Kale preferred it that way. After what had happened on Arcturus Prime, after the betrayal, after watching his unit get slaughtered because of faulty intelligence that he later discovered had been deliberately falsified, solitude was a comfort. No people meant no complications, no relationships, no trust to be broken. Just him, the storms, and occasionally the haunting silence of the stars when the skies cleared. His military training had never quite left him, though. Each night before sleep, he checked his modified service pistol, made sure the perimeter sensors were active, and placed the weapon within arm's reach of his sleeping pod. Old habits from a life he'd tried to leave behind, but couldn't quite shake. The storm intensified, and Kale felt the vibrations through the metal flooring. A particularly violent gust made the entire structure groan, followed by what sounded like an explosion in the distance. He paused, head tilted, listening. That wasn't normal storm behavior. The outpost's sensors flashed, registering an impact approximately 1 kilometer from his location. Curiosity and caution warred within him. 3 years without incident had made him comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. But military instinct won out. He strapped on his pistol, donned his protective gear, and cycled through the airlock to investigate. Once he was sure the winds had died down enough to permit safe passage. The landscape of Cygnus X-3 was never what anyone would call beautiful. All rust-colored rock and shifting sand under a perpetually bruised sky, but the storm had reshaped the terrain yet again, exposing metal fragments that glinted dully in the weak light of the setting sun. Debris from something that had crashed. Not natural debris, manufactured. Kale followed the trail, weapon ready. What he found wasn't a crashed ship as he'd expected, but rather what appeared to be some kind of escape pod, badly damaged and partially buried in sand. And more surprisingly, a trail of disturbed dust leading away from it, as if someone or something had crawled from the wreckage. The trail led toward his outpost. Heart pounding, Kale retraced his steps quickly, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved in the desolate landscape except dust devils stirred up by lingering wind. As he approached his bunker, he saw it, a crumpled form half buried in sand near his airlock door. Weapon raised, he approached cautiously. The figure didn't move, even as a shadow fell across it. Using the barrel of his pistol, he nudged aside some of the sand, revealing what appeared to be a humanoid form in a shredded environmental suit. The helmet was cracked, revealing glimpses of pale skin beneath. Military training told him to secure the area first, to check for others, to approach this as a potential threat. But something else, something he thought he'd left behind on Arcturus Prime, made him holster his weapon and drop to his knees. The figure was small, clearly injured, and posed no immediate danger. With careful movements, he turned the body over. His breath caught. It was a woman. At least she appeared female in the broad strokes of biology, but definitely not human. Her skin was pale violet with faint, phosphorescent patterns that seemed to pulse weakly beneath the surface. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, with high cheekbones and a slightly elongated skull. Most striking were her partially opened eyes, large, almond-shaped, and a brilliant amber color unlike anything Kale had ever seen. She was also badly injured. Blood, dark blue, almost black, seeped through tears in her suit. Burns that looked like energy weapon scoring marked her exposed skin, and her breathing was ragged and shallow. Kale hesitated. The smart thing would be to leave her, or perhaps contact the nearest colony administration outpost, 3 weeks' journey away. Harboring an unknown alien could violate any number of interstellar protocols. She could be dangerous. She could bring danger with her. But as he looked at her injuries, some of which appeared methodical, almost surgical in their precision, a cold realization formed. These weren't just crash injuries. Someone had done this to her. Deliberately. An old memory surfaced, his sister Ilara's voice from childhood. Being afraid to help someone who needs it makes you know better than the person who hurt them. Cursing under his breath, Kale carefully lifted the alien woman. She was surprisingly light, almost fragile in his arms. Inside the airlock, he hesitated again, years of military caution warring with basic decency. But the decision had already been made. He cycled through and carried her inside. The next hours were a blur of improvised medical care. Kale's military training included basic field medicine, and the mining outpost had a well-stocked medical bay, designed for industrial accidents rather than what appeared to be torture and energy weapon wounds, but serviceable nonetheless. He carefully removed her damaged environmental suit, cleaned and dressed her wounds, set up in 4 with universal electrolyte solution, thankfully compatible with most carbon-based life forms, and administered broad-spectrum antibiotics and pain management. Throughout it all, she remained unconscious, occasionally making small, distressed sounds that made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. When he'd done all he could medically, he placed her on his own sleeping pod, covering her with a thermal blanket, and took up position in a chair nearby, his pistol once again within reach. As he watched her chest rise and fall with labored breaths, he wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. For 3 years, he'd successfully avoided complications, entanglements, responsibilities. Now he had an injured alien fugitive in his bed, and judging by her wounds, whoever had been pursuing her wasn't interested in taking her alive. "What did you get yourself into?" he murmured, though the question was as much for himself as for her. The woman didn't stir, her luminous skin patterns pulsing faintly in the dimmed lights of his quarters. Each pulse seemed to match her heartbeat, creating an otherworldly rhythm that Kale found himself unconsciously timing his own breathing to. Despite his intention to remain vigilant, exhaustion eventually claimed him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep in the chair, one hand still resting on his weapon. He awoke to the sensation of being watched. His eyes snapped open, hand tightening on his pistol. The alien woman was awake, propped up slightly on one elbow, staring at him with those remarkable amber eyes. Her posture was defensive, tense, ready to flee despite her obvious weakness. The luminous patterns on her skin pulsed rapidly now, creating swirling configurations that somehow conveyed anxiety and fear without words. Kale slowly raised his empty hand, palm out, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "You're safe," he said, knowing she probably couldn't understand his language, but hoping his tone conveyed the meaning. She remained frozen, her eyes darting around the room, cataloging exits, potential weapons, threats. A survivor's assessment that Kale recognized all too well. When her gaze returned to him, there was calculation mixed with the fear. "Kale," he said, pointing to himself. "I'm Kale." He gestured to the medical supplies, then to her bandaged wounds, trying to indicate that he had helped her. The woman watched his movements with intense concentration. After a long moment, she touched her own chest with a 6-fingered hand. "Lyra," she said, her voice musical and slightly resonant, as if 2 tones were being produced simultaneously. "Lyra," Kale repeated, and she nodded once, sharply. It was a start. The next days established a cautious routine. Lyra was severely weakened from her injuries and malnutrition, but she refused to stay in the sleeping pod. Instead, she insisted on sitting up in a corner of the living area where she could see all entrances and exits. Kale recognized the behavior. He'd seen it in soldiers who'd been prisoners of war. Communication was initially limited to gestures and single words. Kale would point to an object and name it. Lyra would repeat it with her musical dual-toned voice, her pronunciation becoming more precise with each attempt. She seemed to have an extraordinary facility for language, picking up vocabulary at a rate that astonished him. When he brought her food, simple nutrition cubes, and synthesized protein. She initially refused to eat until she saw him consume some first. Even then, she ate with suspicious caution, as if expecting poison. The behavior made Kale's jaw clench with anger at whoever had traumatized her so thoroughly. Gradually, Lyra's strength began to return. The luminous patterns on her skin became brighter, more complex in their configurations. Kale found himself mesmerized by them. The way they shifted with her mood, rapid and jagged when she was anxious, slower and more fluid when she was calm. He wondered if they were a form of communication among her people, or perhaps a physiological response like human facial expressions. On the 5th day, as Kale was dressing on a particularly nasty burn on her arm, she spoke a complete sentence. "Thank you for help." 4. Saving. Kale looked up, surprised. "You're learning quickly." "Must learn." "Survival." Her amber eyes held his. "Why you help?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself repeatedly. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "You needed it." Many would not. Would fear. Would report. Report to whom? Kale asked, seizing the opportunity to get some information. Lyra's skin patterns pulsed rapidly, agitated. "Hunters. Seekers. Those who. What would I have? And what's that?" She tapped her temple with a 6-fingered hand. "Knowledge. Memory. History." She seemed to struggle for words, then said, "I am keeper. For my people." Kale frowned. "Keeper? Like a librarian?" "More. Living archive. I carry." She touched her chest, where a subtle raised pattern was visible beneath her borrowed clothing. "All we are. Were. Will be." The implications slowly dawned on Kale. "You're saying you? What? Carry your people's entire cultural memory." Physically, Lyra nodded. "Neural patterns. Data. Stories. Science. Art. All here." She tapped her temple again. "Special neural structure. Few can be chosen. Trained for child. And someone wants to, what, extract this information." Her skin patterns darkened, nearly going out. "Yes. Extraction. Would kill me. Use knowledge to find my people. Destroy or enslave." She met his eyes directly. "Have been running. Many systems. Many cycles." Kale sat back, processing this. "And they shot you down here?" "Ship damaged. Had to emergency land. Thought lost them, but..." She shook her head. "They will come. Always come." The revelation settled heavily between them. Kale stood and moved to the small viewport, staring out at the barren landscape of Cygnus X-3. For 3 years, he'd sought isolation, neutrality, and escape from conflict. Now conflict had literally crashed at his doorstep. "I should go," Lyra said softly behind him. "Bring danger to you." Kale found himself shaking his head before he'd consciously decided. "You're in no condition to travel." He turned back to her. "Besides, where would you go? This moon is barely habitable outside this outpost. Better I die than they find." "No one's dying," Kale interrupted sharply. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. He moderated his tone. "Not while I can help it." Something shifted in Lyra's expression, a softening, a recognition. She studied him with those remarkable amber eyes. "You have lost ones before." The observation struck too close to his carefully buried past. Kale turned away again, his jaw tight. "We all have losses." "Show me," Lyra said, gesturing to his quarters. "Your place. How it works. If I stay, I help." It was a peace offering, a way to change the subject, while acknowledging his decision to let her stay. Kale accepted it gratefully, beginning to show her the outpost systems, explaining how the water reclamation worked, how the atmospheric regulators maintained pressure and breathable air where the emergency protocols were located. Lyra absorbed it all with keen intelligence, asking perceptive questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of technology. By the end of the day, she was helping him repair a chronically malfunctioning air filter, her 6-fingered hands proving remarkably dexterous with the small components. As they worked, Kale found himself watching her more than the repair. The concentrated furrow between her brows, the way her head tilted when she was thinking, the graceful economy of her movements, all of it fascinated him in a way he hadn't expected. It had been so long since he'd had any company at all, let alone someone so otherworldly. When they successfully restored the filter to full function, Lyra smiled for the first time, a radiant expression that made the luminous patterns on her skin form intricate, beautiful spirals. Cale felt something long dormant within him respond to that smile, a warmth he'd thought permanently extinguished after Arcturus Prime. That night, after insisting Lyra take the sleeping pod while he used a makeshift bedroll on the floor, Cale lay awake long into the night cycle, listening to her soft breathing and wondering how, after 3 years of carefully constructed solitude, he had so quickly adjusted to sharing his space with another being. More disturbingly, he wondered how he would feel when she inevitably left. Over the next 2 weeks, as Lyra's wounds healed and her strength returned, life at the outpost fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were spent on maintenance tasks, with Lyra proving herself remarkably adept at repairing equipment that Cale had long given up on. Afternoons often found them improving the outpost's defenses, a project Cale had initiated with increasing urgency as Lyra's warnings about her pursuers sank in. Evenings were spent in conversation, with Lyra's command of his language growing impressively each day. She told him about her people, the Lamini, a species with a complex social structure based around knowledge preservation. Their natural neural architecture allowed certain individuals to undergo a process that enhanced memory and cognitive capacity to extraordinary levels, turning them into living repositories of cultural knowledge. "My people scattered," she explained one night, her luminous skin patterns forming slow, sad whirls. "After the invasion, too few to fight. So we hide, preserve, wait." "Who invaded?" Cale asked, passing her a cup of synthesized tea they discovered she could tolerate. "The hegemony." Her patterns darkened at the name. "They consume, take resources, knowledge, people, make all serve them. Their technology needs specific resources, rare, found on our worlds. And you're one of these knowledge keepers," Cale said. It wasn't a question. Lyra nodded. "One of last 7. Others hidden. Different systems." Her amber eyes met his. "I carry biological sciences, medical knowledge, agricultural adaptation techniques, how to live on harsh worlds." Valuable knowledge indeed, Cale thought, especially to an expanding empire. "And they've been hunting you for how long?" 3 of your years," she said. "Since escape from research facility." Cale's hand tightened on his cup. "Research facility?" Lyra's skin patterns contracted into tight, painful configurations. She didn't speak, but her hand unconsciously moved to a particular scar on her neck, one that Cale had noticed was more precise, more deliberate than her other injuries. "They tried to extract the information," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Partial only. I resisted, escaped during transport to deeper facility." Her voice had gone flat, emotionless. "Many died helping me. My handler, 2 guards who had conscience." Cale recognized the tone, the deliberate detachment used to recount trauma without reliving it. He'd used it himself when required to debrief after Arcturus Prime. Without thinking, he reached across the small table and covered her 6-fingered hand with his own. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Lyra looked at their joined hands with an expression of wonder, as if the gesture was unfamiliar but welcome. Her skin patterns shifted to a configuration he hadn't seen before, gentle, pulsing waves that emanated from where their hands touched and spread across her visible skin. They sat like that for a long moment, connected by touch and shared understanding of loss. Finally, Lyra gently turned her hand over, so their palms met. The sensation was strange, but pleasant. Her skin was smoother than human skin, slightly cooler, with a subtle vibration from the bioluminescent patterns. "Your turn," she said softly. "Your story." Cale almost withdrew his hand, his instinct to deflect kicking in strongly. But something in her amber gaze, an openness, a lack of judgment, made the words come more easily than they ever had before. "I was a military engineer," he began. "Special operations. My unit was deployed to Arcturus Prime during the colonial uprising." He told her everything. The mission, The faulty intelligence that had sent his unit into an ambush, his desperate attempt to get them out, watching them die one by one. His subsequent discovery that the intelligence hadn't been faulty at all. It had been deliberately falsified to sacrifice his unit as a distraction, while corporate interests secured valuable mining rights elsewhere on the planet. I tried to report it, to get justice, but the corporations involved had too much power, too many government officials in their pockets. His voice had gone bitter. They discredited me. Dishonorable discharge. Made it look like I had been the one to make the fatal mistake. So you ran, Lyra said, understanding in her voice. Like me, I ran, Cale agreed. Bought this abandoned outpost with what was left of my family inheritance. Decided humanity wasn't worth the trouble. Lyra's 6 fingers tightened around his hand. One evil action does not make all evil, she said. Some of your kind helped me too, like you help now. The observation was simple, but struck deep, challenging the narrative he'd constructed to justify his isolation. Before he could formulate a response, a sharp alarm blared from the outpost perimeter sensors. Both of them stiffened. Cale was on his feet instantly, moving to the monitoring station. The external cameras showed nothing in the immediate vicinity, but the motion sensors had definitely been triggered. Could be an animal, he said, though they both knew the native fauna of Cygnus X3 was limited to microorganisms and small, lizard-like creatures too small to trigger the sensors. Not animal, Lyra said, her voice tight with certainty. She pointed to a different reading on the monitor. Electromagnetic disturbance. Cloaking technology. Cale's blood ran cold. You're sure? Hegemony. Signature. Recognize it. Her skin patterns had contracted to tight, pulsing points of light, like stars seen through atmosphere. Scout drone. Searching. How did they find you so quickly? Cale muttered, already moving to secure the outpost's external access points. Track damage pod maybe. Or, she hesitated. Implant. During captivity. Tried to remove, but... You think they've been tracking you all along? Why wait until now? Signal weak. Intermittent. Need proximity to detect. Her hands are shaking slightly. I bring death to you. I should. Stop, Cale said firmly. We're past that discussion. He checked his weapon, made sure it was fully charged. We need a plan. If it's just a drone. Never just drone, Lyra cut in. Drone finds. Confirms. Then they come. The implication was clear. They had a little time, but not much. Cale ran a hand through his short hair, mind racing through options. How many typically? Extraction team. 4 to 6 warriors. 1 inquisitor. The clinical terms couldn't hide the fear in her voice. Heavily armed? Yes. Energy weapons. Stun technology. Neural disruptors. Cale nodded, already mentally cataloging the outpost's defensive capabilities and his own hidden cache of military equipment he'd brought with him into exile. Then we prepare. Make this place as defensible as possible. You would fight? Lyra asked, her amber eyes wide with disbelief. For me? What? Cale looked at her, really looked at her, at the being who had crashed into his carefully constructed isolation and somehow, in just 2 short weeks, made him feel more alive than he had in years, who had listened to his darkest moments without judgment, whose courage in the face of relentless pursuit humbled him. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply, and because I'm tired of running from fights that matter. Something shifted in Lyra's expression, a recognition, a deepening. The luminous patterns on her skin formed a configuration he'd never seen before, intensely bright and complex. She stepped closer to him, placed one 6-fingered hand on his chest, directly over his heart. Then we fight together, she said. The next 36 hours were a flurry of preparations. Cale unearthed military-grade weapons and equipment he'd smuggled from his former life. Pulse rifles, tactical armor, motion sensors more sophisticated than the outpost's standard equipment. Lyra proved invaluable, her knowledge of hegemony technology and tactics helping them anticipate their enemy's approach. They converted the outpost into a fortress, sealing unnecessary access points, creating choke points, rigging traps that would capitalize on the pursuers' unfamiliarity with the environment. Lyra even managed to modify some of the mining equipment into improvised weapons using principles Kale would never have thought of. Your people must have been formidable warriors before the invasion, he commented as she calibrated a repurposed mining laser. Lyra shook her head, the luminous patterns on her skin forming thoughtful waves. Not warriors, survivors. Different strength. She looked up at him. Adaptability, preservation, long view. She gestured to the makeshift weapon. Knowledge is tool and weapon both. As they worked, they moved in an increasingly synchronized rhythm, anticipating each other's needs, communicating sometimes with just a look or gesture. It reminded Kale of working with his old military unit, but with an added dimension he couldn't quite name, a resonance, a harmony that felt both natural and extraordinary. By the time their preparations were complete, both were exhausted but grimly satisfied. The outpost was as secure as they could make it. Now, they could only wait. You should rest, Kale told Lyra, noting the dimming of her skin patterns, a sign he'd come to recognize as fatigue. I'll take first watch. For once, she didn't argue. The healing of her injuries and the intensity of their preparations had taken their toll. She retreated to the sleeping pod, but paused at the doorway. Kale, she said softly. Thank you. For everything. Before he could respond, she did something unexpected. She crossed back to him and pressed her forehead against his in a deliberate gesture, her hands lightly framing his face. Where their skin touched, he felt a gentle, tingling warmth, and her luminous patterns seemed to flow toward the point of contact. Among my people, she explained as she drew back, this is acknowledgement of deepest trust. Kale felt something shift within him, a wall crumbling that he hadn't even realized was still standing. Lyra, the proximity alarm blared, cutting him off. Both of them tensed, immediately shifting from the intimate moment to combat readiness. They're here, Lyra whispered, her amber eyes wide but determined. Kale checked the monitors. The external cameras showed nothing, but the motion and heat sensors told a different story. Multiple contacts. Approaching from the northwest, moving in a tactical formation he recognized from his military days. They were still utilizing cloaking technology, but it couldn't hide their heat signatures or the disturbance they created moving through the loose soil. 6 contacts, he reported. Just as you predicted. Lyra nodded grimly. 5 warriors. 1 inquisitor. Her skin patterns had contracted to tight, defensive configurations. Inquisitor, most dangerous. Has neural tech. Can cause pain with thought. Then we take the Inquisitor out first, Kale said, handing her a modified pulse rifle. Remember the plan. Let them think they have the advantage. Let them enter the primary chamber. Then we spring the trap. They move to their predetermined positions, Kale hidden in a maintenance shaft overlooking the main chamber, Lyra concealed in a storage compartment with a clear line of fire. Both were dressed in the tactical armor Kale had provided, though hers had required significant modification to accommodate her different physiology. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then came the sound of the outer airlock being bypassed. Not forced, but expertly hacked. Kale was impressed despite himself. The hegemony's technology was clearly advanced. The inner door slid open, and they entered. Even prepared, Kale felt a chill at the sight of them. 5 warriors in sleek, insectoid armor of dark metal that seemed to absorb light, their faces hidden behind featureless helmets. They moved with inhuman grace, energy weapons held at the ready. Behind them came a taller figure in robes of the same light-absorbing material, but without a helmet, revealing a face that was almost humanoid except for eyes that were entirely black and skin that seemed to shift color slightly with each movement, like oil on water. The Inquisitor. Kale could feel the wrongness emanating from the being, a palpable malevolence that made his combat instincts scream. The Keeper is here, the Inquisitor said, its voice a sibilant whisper that somehow carried perfectly. I feel her presence. Find her. The warriors spread out methodically, searching the outpost with practiced efficiency. They were thorough but overconfident, not expecting serious resistance on an isolated mining moon. They missed Kale's position entirely and passed by Lyra's hiding spot without a second glance. When all 6 intruders were fully in the main chamber, Kale caught Lyra's eye across the room and nodded once. He pressed the detonator. The modified mining charges they'd placed exploded with concussive force, not designed to kill, but to disorient. Blinding light, deafening sound, and a localized electromagnetic pulse that should disrupt the enemy's communications and perhaps their weapons. In the chaos that followed, Kale and Lyra emerged from their hiding places, firing with deadly precision. 2 warriors went down immediately, their armor no match for the military-grade weapons Kale had provided. A third staggered, wounded but still fighting. The Inquisitor, however, recovered with unnatural speed. It raised a hand toward Lyra, and she cried out, dropping to one knee as if struck by an invisible force. Her skin patterns spasmed erratically, signs of intense pain. Rage surged through Kale. He abandoned his covered position and charged the Inquisitor directly, firing as he moved. The being turned its attention to him, and Kale felt a spike of excruciating pain lance through his skull. But military training took over. He'd been conditioned to fight through pain, to use it as fuel. He tackled the Inquisitor bodily, disrupting its concentration. The mental attack faltered, and Kale pressed his advantage, driving the creature back with physical force it clearly hadn't expected. The Inquisitor might have powerful mental abilities, but it wasn't a physical fighter. Around them, Lyra had recovered and was engaged with the remaining warriors, using both her weapon and her knowledge of their tactics to hold her own. The confined space of the outpost worked in their favor, negating the warriors' superior numbers. Kale and the Inquisitor grappled, each trying to gain advantage. The creature was surprisingly strong, its skin shifting and writhing beneath Kale's grip as if trying to escape. It hissed words in an unknown language, clearly attempting to activate some kind of power or technology. Kale didn't give it the chance. He headbutted the being with all his strength, a brutal, inelegant move that nonetheless stunned it momentarily. In that instant of advantage, he drove his combat knife up under the creature's jaw, through the soft tissue, and into what he hoped was its brain. The Inquisitor convulsed, its eyes widening in what might have been shock or outrage. Black ichor that burned like acid spilled over Kale's hands, but he didn't relent, driving the blade deeper until the creature went limp. He turned to find Lyra standing over the bodies of the remaining warriors, breathing hard, her skin patterns wild and chaotic with combat adrenaline. One of the warriors still moved weakly. Without hesitation, she fired a final shot that stilled it permanently. Their eyes met across the carnage, both of them bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition of what they'd just accomplished together, of how perfectly they'd fought as a unit. "Are you hurt?" Kale asked, crossing to her. Lyra shook her head, though he could see fresh blood, her dark blue, almost black blood, seeping through a tear in her armor at the shoulder. "Not badly." Kale became aware of his own injuries then, cuts, burns, and what was likely a cracked rib. "Nothing serious," he assured her. They stood amid the aftermath, the quiet suddenly deafening after the chaos of battle. The smell of ozone from energy weapons and the metallic tang of blood, both human and alien, filled the air. "We should make sure they didn't call for reinforcements," Kale said, moving to check the Inquisitor's body for communication devices. "They would not," Lyra said with certainty. "Hegemony operates in cells. Independent. This team expected success, not resistance." She knelt beside one of the fallen warriors, removing a device from its armor. "Confirmation would be sent only after capture. So we're safe? For now, at least." Lyra nodded. "For now. Others will come eventually, when this team fails to report. But not soon." She looked around at the damaged outpost. "We have time." They spent the next hours attending to their wounds and beginning the process of cleaning up. The bodies of the hegemony forces were dragged outside and buried deep in the shifting sands, where the next dust storm would erase all evidence of their presence. The damaged sections of the outpost were secured as best they could manage. By the time they had finished emergency repairs, both were swaying with exhaustion. Without discussion, they retreated to Kale's quarters, neither wanting to be alone after what they'd experienced. "We should both rest," Kale said, gesturing to the sleeping pod. "You take it. I'll—" "No," Lyra interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Share, please." She gestured to her wounds, then his. "Both need healing. Better together. Body heat. Comfort." The suggestion would have seemed wildly inappropriate just days ago. Now, after fighting for their lives together, it felt natural. Kale nodded, too tired to argue even if he'd wanted to. They removed their armor, but kept their underclothes on, an unspoken acknowledgement of boundaries still to be respected. The sleeping pod was designed for one person, but Lyra was slight, and they fit, though snugly. She curled against him, her back to his chest, her luminous skin casting a gentle glow that pulsed in slow, peaceful waves. "Your heart," she murmured sleepily. "Strong rhythm. Good sound." Kale found himself smiling in the darkness. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "We're safe for now." As exhaustion claimed him, his last conscious thought was how right it felt to have her there, how the emptiness of the outpost that had once been a comfort now seemed unbearable without her presence. They slept for nearly 10 hours, their bodies demanding recovery after the intensity of the fight. Kale woke first, momentarily disoriented by the warm weight against him, the soft glow illuminating the sleeping pod. Lyra was still deeply asleep, her breathing even, her skin patterns moving in slow, dreamlike configurations. He allowed himself a moment to simply look at her, this remarkable being who had crashed into his life and irrevocably changed it. The curve of her cheek, the slight point of her ears, the delicate ridge along her forehead that he now knew was a distinctive feature of her species. Different, yes, but beautiful in a way that transcended species. As if sensing his gaze, Lyra stirred, her amber eyes opening slowly. For a moment she seemed confused. Then her gaze focused on him, and her skin patterns shifted to a configuration he'd come to associate with contentment. "You stayed," she said softly. "It's my sleeping pod," he replied with gentle humor. "Where would I go?" She smiled at that, a gesture she'd clearly learned from him that had become more natural with practice. "Me metaphorically. You did not leave after fight." "Could have. Leave you?" The idea seemed absurd now. "Never crossed my mind. Others would. Once danger known." Her six-fingered hand reached up hesitantly, then rested against his cheek. "You are rare, Kale." The simple touch sent warmth spreading through him. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with tenderness rather than violence. Without thinking, he turned his face slightly into her palm, a gesture of acceptance and reciprocation. "We should check the outpost systems," he said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "Make sure nothing critical was damaged in the fight." Lyra nodded, but she too remained where she was, as if reluctant to break the peaceful moment. "Will they come back?" "Others like them." "Eventually," Kale admitted. "But we'll be ready." He paused, realizing what he'd said. "That is, if you're staying. I understand if you need to keep moving, find somewhere safer." "No safer place," she interrupted. "No better companion in fight." Her skin patterns formed intricate, determined configurations. "Here we make stand. Together." The conviction in her voice stirred something in Kale that had been dormant for too long. Purpose, resolve, a willingness to fight for something that mattered. He nodded once, decision made. Together, he agreed. They spent the next days repairing the outpost, salvaging what they could from the hegemony attackers' equipment, some of which proved to be technological marvels that even Kale's military experience hadn't prepared him for. Lyra's knowledge proved invaluable, helping them repurpose the alien tech to strengthen their defenses. As they worked side by side, their cooperation became increasingly seamless, anticipating each other's needs and movements with an almost preternatural awareness. Sometimes they would work for hours in comfortable silence, other times sharing stories. Kale of his childhood on Earth's European continent, Lyra of her early training as a keeper on her home world with its 3 moons and perpetual twilight. One evening, as they sat sharing a meal of synthesized protein that Lyra had somehow managed to make taste almost pleasant with salvaged hegemony food technology, Kale found himself watching her hands as she gestured while speaking. The grace of her movements, the subtle luminosity of her skin that seemed to intensify when she was animated about a subject. It all fascinated him. "You're staring," Lyra observed, pausing mid-sentence. Kale felt heat rise to his face, embarrassed at being caught. "Sorry, I was just—" He hesitated, then decided on honesty. "You're beautiful when you're excited about something. Your skin patterns, they dance." The compliment made Lyra's patterns pulse rapidly, brightening in what he now recognized as her species' equivalent of a blush. "Oh, is good thing to be beautiful to you?" "Yes," Kale said simply. "It's a very good thing." "You also," she said after a moment, her amber eyes holding his. "Beautiful to me. Strange, but beautiful. Strong. Kind." She hesitated, then added, "Was not expecting, when crash here, to find you." The admission hung between them, fraught with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Kale reached across the table and took her hand, their now familiar differences, his 5 fingers to her 6, her cooler temperature, the subtle vibration of her bioluminescence, no longer strange, but simply parts of her that he had come to cherish. "I wasn't expecting you either," he said, "but I'm glad you found me." They might have said more, might have crossed the remaining distance between them, but the moment was interrupted by a sharp alert from the monitoring system they'd enhanced with hegemony technology. Both immediately tensed, the brief idyll shattered by the reminder of their precarious situation. Kale moved quickly to the console, Lyra right behind him. The readings were concerning. An atmospheric disturbance consistent with a ship entering the moon's thin atmosphere, still distant but approaching. "Could be a routine mining scout," Kale said, though he didn't believe it. "This sector gets checked for new mineral deposits every few years." Lyra shook her head, her skin patterns contracting with anxiety. "No, feel it. Hegemony ship. Larger than expected." She pointed to a particular reading. "Engine signature. Unmistakable." Kale's military training kicked in, assessing their options with cold efficiency. "How many aboard a ship that size?" "Standard complement, 20 warriors. 2 or 3 inquisitors." Her voice was tight. "Too many. Cannot fight directly." "Then we don't fight directly," Kale said, mind already racing through alternatives. "We've been preparing for a small team, but we can adapt." He pulled up schematics of the surrounding terrain on another screen. The old mining tunnels. They extend for kilometers under the surface. If we can lead them in there. "Ambush," Lyra finished, catching his thinking immediately. "Use environment. Their numbers become disadvantage in confined space." "Exactly. And we know those tunnels. They don't." Kale began gathering equipment. "We need to move fast. Take what we can carry, set traps here at the outpost to slow them down, then disappear into the tunnel system." They worked with practiced efficiency, gathering weapons, supplies, medical equipment, anything essential that could be transported. Kale showed Lyra how to set demolition charges at strategic points throughout the outpost, designed to confuse and delay rather than kill, giving them time to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. Within an hour, they were ready, standing at the concealed entrance to the mining tunnels. Kale took one last look at the outpost that had been his refuge and prison for 3 years. He felt a momentary pang at abandoning it, but the structure meant nothing compared to the life he was now fighting to protect. Lyra touched his arm gently. "Home is not place," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Is where safety." "Where?" She seemed to search for the right word, then touched her chest. "Where heart resides." Kale covered her hand with his own, nodding in understanding. "Let's go." They descended into the tunnels just as their enhanced sensors detected the hegemony ship entering the final approach to the outpost. The timing would be tight, but if all went according to plan, the enemy would find an empty outpost rigged with traps and false leads, while Kale and Lyra would be positioned deep in the tunnel system at a location they had chosen for its defensive advantages. The hours that followed were a tense waiting game. They moved through the dimly lit tunnels, Lyra's natural bioluminescence providing enough light to navigate by once they were far enough from the entrance to risk using it. They set additional traps as they went, tripwires connected to mining charges, false passages designed to confuse, recording devices that would play sounds of movement to lead pursuers astray. Finally, they reached their chosen battleground, a chamber where 3 tunnel passages converged, offering multiple escape routes, but forcing any attackers to enter through a single point. They quickly established defensive positions, set up the last of their traps, and settled in to wait. The first explosion from the direction of the outpost reached them as a distant rumble that made small pebbles shower down from the tunnel ceiling. Lyra's skin patterns pulsed with tense, tight configurations. "It begins," she whispered. Cale checked his weapon one last time, then reached over to squeeze her hand briefly. "No matter what happens, I want you to know." "I know," she interrupted, her amber eyes luminous in the dimness. "I also." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his in that gesture of deepest trust she had shown him before. This time, however, she followed it with something new, a light touch of her lips to his, brief but unmistakable in its intent. Before Cale could respond, the sound of distant weapons fire echoed through the tunnels. The enemy had found one of their early traps. The fight was truly beginning. "Ready?" he asked, refocusing on the imminent threat. Lyra nodded, raising her weapon. Together, the next hours became a lethal game of cat and mouse throughout the tunnel system. The hegemony forces entered the tunnels in strength, but as Cale had predicted, their numbers became a hindrance in the narrow passages. They were forced to split into smaller search parties, exactly as he and Lyra had hoped. The two of them moved like ghosts through the tunnel network, striking small groups of warriors with hit-and-run attacks, using the charges they'd placed to collapse tunnels behind them, gradually whittling down the enemy's numbers while avoiding direct confrontation with larger groups or the dreaded Inquisitors. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work. Several times they narrowly escaped discovery, once having to hide motionless in a flooded side passage for nearly an hour, breathing through reed-like tubes Cale had improvised, while a search party passed within meters of their position. But their strategy was working. The hegemony forces were becoming disoriented in the maze-like tunnels, their casualties mounting, their coordination faltering as Cale and Lyra systematically destroyed their communication relays. The turning point came when they managed to separate one of the Inquisitors from its warrior escort. Setting a trap with themselves as bait, they lured the powerful being into a chamber they had prepared specifically for such an encounter. When the Inquisitor attempted to use its mental abilities, it discovered too late that the unusual mineral composition of the chamber, enhanced by devices they had salvaged from the previous attackers, reflected and amplified its attack back upon itself. The creature's agonized psychic scream echoed through the tunnels, disorienting and demoralizing the remaining hegemony forces. In the confusion that followed, Cale and Lyra pressed their advantage, driving the invaders back toward the surface with a series of devastating ambushes. By the time they emerged from the tunnels, following the retreating enemy, night had fallen on the surface of Cygnus X-3. The hegemony ship was visible in the distance, its sleek, predatory form silhouetted against the larger of the moon's 2 suns just starting to rise on the horizon. Around it, the surviving warriors and the remaining Inquisitor were in disarray, having lost over half their number in the tunnels. "They're retreating," Cale observed from their concealed position among the rocky outcroppings near the tunnel entrance. They didn't expect this kind of resistance. "Not retreating," Lyra corrected, her tone grim. "Regrouping. We'll call reinforcements." She pointed to the ship. Communications array activating. Cale's mind raced. If the ship was allowed to call for reinforcements, everything they had accomplished would be for nothing. They might have won this battle, but the next wave would be overwhelming. "We need to stop that transmission," he said. "The ship itself is our target now." Lyra looked at him with concern. "Too well defended. Suicide to attack directly." "Not directly," Cale agreed. "But remember those mining charges we didn't use? The heavy-duty ones designed for breaking through the moon's hardest rock layers." Understanding dawned in Lyra's amber eyes. "The ship's landing struts. If destabilized, the whole ship topples," Cale finished. and a grounded ship can't transmit effectively through this moon's mineral interference. It was risky, beyond risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was their only chance to prevent reinforcements from being called. They gathered the remaining charges and split up, approaching the ship from opposite sides, using the rocky terrain for cover. The hegemony forces were focused on boarding, not expecting an attack when they believed they were the ones retreating. Kale and Lyra each managed to place charges at 2 of the ship's 4 landing struts before being detected. Alarms blared. Warriors poured out of the ship's boarding ramp. The remaining Inquisitor appeared at the top of the ramp, its dark eyes scanning the terrain. Kale, pinned down behind a rocky outcropping by energy weapon fire, frantically signaled to Lyra across the open ground. She nodded, understanding his intent. They had placed enough charges to destabilize the ship. It was time to detonate and retreat. But before either could activate their detonator, the Inquisitor made a sharp gesture. 2 warriors dragged a figure from the ship, a female of Lyra's species, badly injured, her skin patterns flickering weakly. Another keeper, Lyra gasped, her voice breaking. Izira, my kin sister. The Inquisitor's voice carried across the open ground, unnaturally amplified. Surrender, Keeper Lyra, or watch your sister's mind be torn apart before your eyes. Kale saw the anguish in Lyra's face, the terrible choice before her. To save another keeper would mean surrendering herself and all the knowledge she carried, potentially dooming her entire species. But to let another keeper die when she could prevent it. Don't, Kale called to her. It's a trap. Once they have you both, they'll extract what they want and kill you anyway. Lyra knew he was right. Her rational mind understood the deception. But her heart, her skin patterns formed chaotic, pained configurations as she watched her kin sister suffer. I have plan, she said suddenly, her voice low and intense. When I move, detonate your charges. Do not hesitate. Before Kale could protest, she stood, raising her hands in apparent surrender. Release her first, she called to the Inquisitor. Then I come. The Inquisitor seemed to consider, then nodded to the warriors holding Izira. They loosened their grip slightly, allowing the injured keeper to slump to the ground at the base of the boarding ramp. Lyra began walking forward slowly, her hands still raised. Kale watched in horror, his finger on the detonator, torn between following her instruction and refusing to potentially sacrifice her. What happened next occurred so quickly he almost missed it. As Lyra approached the boarding ramp, her skin suddenly flared with blinding luminosity, far brighter than he had ever seen, a flash that momentarily disoriented everyone looking in her direction. In that instant of confusion, she dropped to the ground, rolled to where Izira lay, and slapped something onto the underside of the boarding ramp. An explosive charge she had kept in reserve. Kale understood immediately. Detonating his charges while Lyra was near the ship would put her in grave danger, but she had just armed another charge directly under the boarding ramp. The only escape route for those aboard. Without hesitation, he pressed his detonator. The charges at the landing struts exploded simultaneously, and the massive ship began to tilt precariously. At the same moment, Lyra's charge detonated, tearing the boarding ramp free from the ship in a cascade of twisted metal. Chaos erupted. The ship listed sharply as 2 of its landing struts collapsed. Warriors were thrown from their feet. The Inquisitor, caught on the failing boarding ramp, tumbled to the ground. Lyra, shielding Izira's body with her own, was already crawling away from the destabilized vessel. Kale broke from cover, laying down suppressing fire to cover Lyra's retreat. The remaining warriors, disorganized and without the Inquisitor's direct mental control, returned. Fire sporadically, their shots going wide. The ship's engines roared as the pilot attempted to compensate for the failing landing struts, but it was too late. With a groaning of stressed metal, the vessel toppled onto its side, crushing several warriors beneath its bulk. Emergency systems activated, energy weapons overloaded, and secondary explosions began to ripple through the downcraft. Kale reached Lyra, helping her drag the semi-conscious Azira behind a large boulder just as the ship's main power core breached. The explosion lit up the night sky of Cygnus X-3 like a newborn sun, the shockwave rolling across the barren landscape, kicking up a blinding storm of dust and debris. When the dust began to settle and Kale could see again, the hegemony ship was a burning hulk, secondary explosions still rippling through its shattered hull. No survivors were visible among the wreckage. "You did it," he said to Lyra, his voice hoarse from the dust. "You saved her and stopped them." Lyra was bent over Azira, examining her injuries with gentle hands. "We did," she corrected. "Together." She looked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting the flames of the destroyed ship. "She will live? Injuries serious but treatable. Will there be more ships?" Kale asked, scanning the night sky warily. Eventually, Lyra admitted. "But not soon." Hegemony methodical but cautious. "Loss of ship and Inquisitor's significant setback. We'll reassess, plan new approach." She stroked Azira's forehead gently. "We have time. Weeks, perhaps months. Then we rebuild," Kale said decisively. "The outpost is damaged, but salvageable. We make it stronger, better defended." "We stay?" Lyra asked, searching his face. "Not run." Kale looked at the destroyed hegemony ship, then back to Lyra and the injured keeper she had risked everything to save. 3 years ago, he had run from injustice, had hidden himself away from the universe and its complications. But meeting Lyra had changed everything, had changed him. "We stay," he confirmed. "This is our home now. We defend it. Together." The journey back to the outpost was slow and careful, hampered by Azira's condition and their own exhaustion. The structure had suffered significant damage from the hegemony force's initial assault, but the core systems remained functional. Over the next days, as Azira recovered under Lyra's care, Kale began the process of rebuilding, salvaging what he could from the wreckage of the hegemony ship to strengthen their defenses. A week after the battle, as the three of them shared a meal in the partially restored living area, Azira spoke directly to Kale for the first time. Her command of his language was less fluent than Lyra's, but understandable. "You fight for my sister when no obligation," she said, her skin patterns forming grateful, respectful configurations. "Risk life for keeper, not your own." "What?" Before Kale could answer, Lyra placed her 6-fingered hand over his. "He is Valashar," she said, using a word in their native language that didn't translate directly. Azira's eyes widened, her skin patterns pulsing with surprise and what might have been approval. She nodded solemnly to Kale, then excused herself, still weak from her injuries and needing rest. "What does that mean?" Kale asked when they were alone. "Valashar." Lyra's skin patterns formed slow, intricate swirls that he had come to associate with deep emotion. Difficult to translate exactly. Closest meaning, husband protector, one who defends not from duty or obligation, but from. She touched her chest, over her heart. "From here." "Husband," Kale repeated, the human term feeling simultaneously inadequate and overwhelming. "Not same as human meaning," Lyra explained carefully. "More sacred. Bond of souls, not just bodies or laws. One who has chosen to share path, share struggle, share life." Her amber eyes held his. "Among my people, rare to find. Many never do." Kale's throat felt tight with emotion. "And you see me this way?" "Yes," she said simply. "Since battle and tunnels. Maybe before. When you chose to fight for me, with me. To risk all." Her skin patterns intensified, luminous and beautiful. "Do you accept? To be Valashar? My husband by my people's understanding." Kale thought about the path that had brought him here, from the betrayal at Arcturus Prime to his self-imposed exile to the wounded alien who had collapsed at his door and changed everything. He thought about the emptiness he had mistaken for peace and the purpose he had found in protecting someone worth fighting for. "Yes," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I accept. In any language, by any definition. I am yours, Lyra." She made a soft sound, a musical hum of joy, and pressed her forehead to his in that now familiar gesture of deepest trust. This time, when she followed it with a kiss. He was ready, returning it with all the emotion he had once thought himself incapable of feeling again. Later, as they stood together looking out at the night sky of Cygnus X-3, Lyra pointed to a distant constellation. My homeworld is there. Perhaps, someday, we find others of my kind. Rebuild. But for now, she turned to look at the outpost they were restoring together. For now, home is here. Cale put his arm around her, feeling the gentle vibration of her bioluminescent patterns against his side. It's a strange home, he admitted. A human, an alien keeper, and now your sister. Not exactly conventional. Lyra laughed, the dual-tone sound that had once seemed so alien, now music to his ears. Convention is for peaceful times. We are survivors. She leaned into him. Better this way. Unexpected family found in stars. Cale looked down at this extraordinary being who had crashed into his life and given it meaning again. His wife, his Valashar, by a definition far deeper than any legal document or ceremony could establish. Unexpected is right, he said with a smile. When I left Earth, I never imagined I'd end up taking in a wounded alien fugitive who showed up at my door, let alone that she would one day call me her husband. Life has strange paths, Lyra agreed, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight. Best paths, often those not planned. As they stood together under the alien sky, Cale felt a peace he had never known in his years of solitude. The hegemony would eventually return, and the fight to protect Lyra and her sister, to protect the knowledge they carried and the future of their people, would continue. But they would face it together, as the family they had forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. And that, Cale thought as he pulled Lyra closer, was worth fighting for.